Welcome to our second in a series of 3 artist talks for Pulped Under Pressure, which is on exhibit at the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking, currently on exhibit. And we hope that you guys will enjoy this talk and also check out the previous talk and then join us for the third talk. Tonight we'll be hearing from Julia Goodman and Trisha Oralie Martin Ibarra, 2 of the 7 artists that are featured in Pulped Under Pressure. I'll share both of their bios and then they'll present and we'll take questions after both speakers have had an opportunity to present. But I would like to share just a little about the museum before we get started. So as I mentioned, this is the second of 3 talks, and the exhibition is up through August 4th. So if you are in town, please come by the museum to see the show in person. There's nothing like seeing it in person. So the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking is located in Atlanta, Georgia, on the campus of the Georgia Institute of Technology. And our mission is to collect, preserve, disseminate knowledge about hand papermaking, past, present, and future. So Julia Goodman creates low and high relief handmade paper sculptures. Goodman earned an MFA from California College of the Arts and a BA in International Relations and Peace and Justice Studies from Tufts University. She studied art at Santa Monica College, and recent exhibitions include National Museum of Women in the Arts, Contemporary Jewish Museum, California, San Jose Museum of Art, the Paul Art Museum, Illinois, Poetry Foundation in Illinois, Salina Art Center in Kansas, St. Mary's College in Indiana, California College of the Arts, the Hubble Street Gallery in California, and the Berkeley Art Center. Her residencies include J.B. Blanc residency in Venice, California, Ecology, San Francisco, Creativity Explored, California, and Salina Art Center in Kansas. Her work is included in the collections of the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the Paul Art Museum, and Google. Goodman lives and works in Berkeley with artist Michael Hall and their young child. She is represented by Uquinum Gallery in San Francisco. Trisha Oralie Martin Ibarra was born and raised in San Diego, California. She spent 8 years working as an educator and artist in Chicago. In 2015, she collaborated with 9 Filipino artists on a John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation funded project through the Field Museum. And her work has been published in Hand Papermaking, shown nationally and internationally, and presented at the Alliance of Artists Communities Conference. She holds an MFA from Columbia College, Chicago, and a BA from San Diego State University. Her teaching and artistic practice are reflective of her Filipino heritage and the philosophy that all humankind, in tandem with the visible and invisible world, are one. Trisha currently teaches at High Tech High Media Arts in San Diego, California. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and the next voice you'll hear will be Julia Goodman.
There we go. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Jerusha, for the introduction. And Trisha, it's so nice to see you again. And I see Marilyn and Rennie are here as well. So it's really nice to see everyone. I am going to set a timer for myself before I forget. And I'm just going to run through the work that led up to the work in the show, and then a few pieces I've made since the show. But for a long time now, it has been urgent for me to find texture working with handmade paper. And a lot of that came, well, it came after my dad passed away. It was really me just trying to understand or process the simple fact that you can't touch somebody after they're gone. And so ever since he passed, I've really had stopped using ink, and it was always about the concave or the convex of the paper. And it also was the beginning of me looking up into the night sky. And I'll talk more about that, but you'll see how it factors in. So the piece on the left side here is a piece I made in 2009 in grad school. It's called Certain Is Nothing Now. And it's made all from recycled or repurposed, mostly junk mail and different discarded paper that I color sorted for blue. And so it's all bluish paper, and maybe there's different colors on the back sides, 50 rings hanging in space. And they're very, oh, there we go. So this is looking up into Certain Is Nothing Now. And there's a concrete likeness to the pieces, but clearly they're so light because they're made of handmade paper. And so when you walk by, they sway, and it's kind of this like undulating oceanic celestial vortex. And when I graduated from grad school, one of my life dreams was to do the residency at Recology, which I eventually did get to do. This is me as I was, so for Recology, you're an artist in residence, you have a studio on site at the dump, you have to wear like hard boots, a neon yellow vest, the whole getup, and then you look for materials to make art from in the public disposal area, which is that pile behind me. And I knew that when I was there, or my proposal for when I was there, is I really wanted to dive into the history of rag paper making. And I ended up making all this work that revolved around the timeline, the chronology of when rag paper making, which it intersected with women's labor. This was the first piece. So the timeline started in 1666, although I realize this isn't specifically women's labor, but this is a piece that was called Above and Below 1666. And there was basically what interested me is that rags were so precious that in order to keep up with the advancements in printmaking, everybody was really trying to scurry to get enough rags to make into paper so that there'd be enough paper to print on. And it was so dramatic that in 1666, to encourage the use of wool and at the same time save linen and cotton for paper makers, the English Parliament in 1666 decreed that only wool could be used in burying the dead. In 1 year, approximately 200,000 pounds of linen and cotton were saved for paper makers by this edict. So this idea of scarcity amongst like something that had no value, basically, or just endlessly fascinated me. And I expected that the timeline would end when in Europe they stopped making paper out of rags and moved on to tree pulp and things like that. But I had this fascinating conversation with a retired, this is a process shot. I should say, this is me carving in wood backwards, the name Rita Bianchi, and this is plywood that I also pulled from the dump. And so when I was at the dump, I had this fascinating conversation with somebody who had retired from there. And he remembered the year 1964, that was the year in San Francisco that they actually stopped recycling rags. They weren't saving them at that point for paper making reasons, but all the garbage men would go out, and in the trucks, they would have a barrel just for rags, and a barrel for glass, and a barrel for aluminum. And the rags would be brought to a room at the dump. And it was mostly Italian immigrant women. And there was no paper trail of these women. They are mostly relatives of garbage men that were working out in on the trucks. But he remembered the name of 7 of these women. And I wanted to honor those women's labor, honor their names. And so I scavenged fabrics from the dump, carved all their names backwards in wood from the dump, and then cast them. And it's an edition of 4. And so this is one of the projects that's on display. And so Rita Bianchi, I should say also all the fonts were pulled from printed materials that I scavenged from the dump that were also pre-1964. Olga Vera, Maria Tringale, and then also the year 1964. Now after, in the 60s, trash started to get more complicated with the introduction of plastics. But the reason that the rag collection stopped in 1964 is that that's the year that they introduced the compacting trash trucks. And so they were no longer sorting rags in the trucks, and therefore no longer in the facilities. The other project that's on display is a book I made called Earth Signs. And it's a book of one large white bed sheet torn down into like 16 pages, I believe. And then on each of those pages, I printed beet papyrus stains as they were drying. And beet papyrus, it was something I started doing, and it was just like laminated beets together. And the earth signs, I did pieces each based on the constellation of the 3 different earth signs. So Virgo, Taurus, and Capricorn. And that's a really small piece, but I thought I would show you guys how large the work got at its maximum. This is a piece called Unearthed, Sunset, November 13th, 9 p.m. And this charts the stars in the sky at the time of that this exhibition opened. And then on the other side, so you'll see there's 2 windows side by side. This piece is called Unearthed Sunrise, November 14th, 6:30 a.m. And so this is how the stars were setting on the horizon line the morning after the opening. And so light is coming through. And from the moment the show opened, these pieces are slowly fading. So the time was really important to me. So all the pieces that are cut, the yellow pieces cut yellow and white in the rounds on this one, those indicate the stars. And then all the beats that were cut lengthwise is the space in between. The one on the left is what it looked like. The one on the right is it backlit with sunlight coming through. The one on the left is with no sunlight coming through, just against a matte background. And I showed you, like, looking up was a big part of the composition and the work that I made after my dad died and in grad school. And after grad school, I felt like maybe I needed to look down. And I had always used found color. And there was something about finding these vibrant, amazing, alive colors underground that really filled me with hope. And they also felt so bodily and also ephemeral, that felt like it was dealing with mortality in a way that I was really interested in. Here's an installation shot for scale. And so on this one, I'm sorry, the pink and beats, the red beats are all the locations of the stars and the constellations that I'm isolating. And this is the backlit and the not backlit side. And this is the installation outside. So there's one in this window right here, the sunset one, and then the sunrise is back here. And then I'll breeze through some work that I've made since then. Inserting the history of the material into my work has been really important. I haven't worked with another set of names yet. I'm actually just starting to work with another name for the first time, but it's not something I can force. It's like research comes when it comes. But another way that I have found of inserting the history of the material, only because most people are very removed from the history of paper making. And even most artists, if you tell them about rag paper, they don't know that particular history. And I'm fascinated the idea of like that these fabrics carry, you know, stories of sleeping, dreaming, love, you know, raising children, caring for the elderly, all these stories in there. And so one way that I've tried to put it into the work, even when it's abstract without spelling it out, is actually doing like inclusion. So right here, this is the white pulp that's been pressed with the texture of white bed sheets, but then coming out of it, you can kind of see there's moments. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but there's actually white bed sheet inclusions in the sculpture. So when you approach the sculpture straight on, it looks like a solid white piece. And then as you round it, the layers separate and you realize that there's color inside. There's actually enough room in the middle for a person to stand in and look to the left and look to the right. And they're mirrored sides, or as mirrored as I could get making them. And this piece, like Certain Is Nothing Now, also is moves in response to movement in the room. So there's this slight swaying. And I don't have time to tell you the whole backstory behind it, but I'd be happy to if anybody's interested later. Let's see. Waning and waxing is an important piece that I made after our son was born. I felt like it was an interesting counterbalance to losing my father. And so the piece on the left is cast from a piece of wood that I had carved after my dad passed away. And it's the 11 months mourning. The Jewish ritual, you say a mourner's Kaddish or a mourner's prayer every day for 11 months after you lose your parent. And the Jewish calendar is lunar based. And so I tracked that full amount of time after he died this way. And then but I should also say that at the time when I was making that in 2007, I was making paper out of paper. So this was one of the pieces that I made in 2007. And then in 2019 and 2020, I revisited that same wooden mold to cast the piece on the left. And then the piece on the right, I carved all the nights of my pregnancy with my son in the same way that I had done 12 years earlier, the same scale ratio. And then this time I cast them both with discarded fabrics. So it's almost like returning to myself or returning to this muscle memory with 12 years later, with a different framework and with a different level of skill, knowing my craft differently. And the other thing that happened that was so important for me with the rags, when I was making paper making after my dad died, one thing that really moved me was how it was so visceral to tear apart paper and for it to come back together. And it reminded me of the Jewish mourning tradition of tearing the black ribbon, wearing a black ribbon with a tear in it. It's called Korea. But the much older tradition is that you would actually render your garment over your heart at the graveside. And during that whole mourning period, you would walk around like with your coat with a tear over your heart. And it was a way of telling everyone that you were in mourning and exposing your heart. And when the mourning period was done, you would sew it back up. And so when I started making paper out of fabric and tearing fabric to make paper, I just felt like one step closer to the heart of where I was coming from. Here's a detail shot. It's hot pink and orange on the backside, and that flips back, that reflects back on the wall. And then I'll just quickly show you some images of newer work and then turn it over to Trisha. This piece was 2 layers cast off of the brick wall behind our house during the pandemic. And again, I'm not adding any pigments or dyes to any of this. I'm just mixing different colored pulped bed sheets and t-shirts. And the rust you see is actually lifting the brick off. And the dirt, it's like absorbing the dirt on the wall. And then this year I switched my rule. I've actually started watercoloring on top of the paper. And here, just full circle, I'm going back to another not a constellation, but a star cluster, the Pleiades star cluster. And then just a little bit more recent work, still about looking up with everyday materials in mind and connecting the domestic with the celestial. And some detail shots. This one, I'm actually doing the watercolor, and where my mouse is, I'm working the inclusions, the fabric inclusions back in here as well. All right, I really want to save time for questions at the end, so I'm going to sign out and turn it over. Thank you, guys.
All right, I guess that's me. Okay. First, I wanted to thank the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking for having us tonight, and for everyone here. I want to acknowledge everyone who's joining us tonight, as well as including my ancestors whose handwork has inspired and informed my work that I'm presenting tonight. And so the way I'm going to talk about the work is to like excavate, starting with the work from the show and work my way back, just to see how I got to this piece. So Textures of the Philippines, made this, feels like decades ago, was a way for me to really weave my research and have a visual dialogue and begin to like also implement my own stories and share those, or just hint at some stories for myself. I grew up here in San Diego at the border, like 2 exits from Tijuana. And so I was surrounded by Mexican culture, and thankfully the beautiful embroideries and vibrant colors and geometric shapes and patterns, those all filled my soul, but I never really had that same experience like from my own culture. I was also drawn to like a lot of African designs, but I was always yearning for that connection to my culture. I knew it existed, but I didn't see it growing up. The access to it was very minimal. And so having worked at the Field Museum, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, and also during my travels, I was privileged with the ability to then really dive into and experience and see these come alive through the material culture that I was finding in the collection at the Field Museum. And so this piece here is my processing of my thoughts, a way for me to like archive what I was learning, and experimenting with like weaving all of these different types of symbols and motifs, some that you'd find on textiles or find on the body as tattoos. And so that's why you have like this high contrast between some of the lino cuts and then the more delicate pulp paintings, which with the pulp paintings, you'd find those designs more on like garments and wood carvings, or other textiles and clay pieces like spirit houses. And so this was born from some experiments that I had been working through and playing with in pulp paintings. I did 2 art shows that were thrown at my friend's warehouse space in Chicago. And so Never Enough was one where I started to work more large scale. And then this black and white art show is when I really started to blow up these symbols and designs and motifs that I was finding. And I think in working at this scale, I was trying to take up space. I grew up taking very little space, being very quiet and obedient, the typical Filipino daughter of an immigrant. And so this was my way to like really immerse myself and start to make space to have these dialogues. And a lot of these symbols too are very recognizable, or at least to me, they seem very like I'd seen them before, very familiar. And so I was learning that they were coming from a lot of influences from Southeast Asian other cultures, or like Polynesia, Malaysia, but then also a lot of the, I mean, they're really graphic, simple geometric shapes and symbols. And so you see these also very similarly in like Mexico or even in Africa, right? So I was finding that I could have these dialogues with people. It draws people in. And this one in particular was my first attempt at like working really large scale. And at that time I was living in Chicago in a really small apartment. And so to be able to utilize like lino cuts and this repetition, I could create really large pieces, but then also, without taking up too much space, they're all two-dimensional. As opposed to the work that I was doing like in grad school, which was very sculptural and like I needed actual space to like have it live and breathe. And for these two, I was starting to also integrate lino cuts and paper making. And so before that, or I guess at the same time, I was working at the Field Museum on the co-curation team. We received a grant to digitize the collection there that was over 10,000 objects to make it accessible virtually for everyone around the world. And so we were photographing the objects, transcribing the catalog cards. But in addition to all that like busy work, we were also having community events, and that was where I was really drawn. I was really excited to like talk to community members, just like everyday aunties and uncles and elders. And our team was really young, and so we really thrived on that intergenerational dialogue that we were having around these objects. And so what sprouted from that was a thematic series of monthly events that I had planned. And in that, I was able to really then dive deeper by inviting folks from pretty much all over the world to come and speak on these objects. So we had like cultural practitioners, artists, scholars, but then also just everyday people, like my Lola could have come and spoken to her experience with these objects or her knowledge, and would have been equally respected and valued for her input. And it was in these events that we were starting to really reimagine how the collection was being used, but also it was the dialogue that I really appreciated having. In having those discussions, was learning that not only was this work important, to like provide access to people for this collection that was otherwise, dormant in the vaults of the Field Museum. In addition to that, I learned really quickly that these objects like had spirits in them and energies that I had felt, but like couldn't articulate or like really talk about in the same way that the cultural practitioners could. And so one of the events that really sticks out to me is the ceremonies one. And it's this photo here where we created altars for the objects. So one to pay respects to the people who made these objects, for the spirits and energies that live within them, for the ones that had been, who gifted these objects or who they were taken away from, just honoring all of that. And then also for us young folks to learn from as well, and take the knowledge from that there's a lot of people that came before us, and I found that for me, all of this was basically a search for my cultural identity and really connecting to my Indigenous roots, something that I didn't have access to growing up. Not for lack of being exposed to it, because I definitely was around it. I had my parents speak the language in the house, multiple dialects. I ate the food. We had experiences like fiestas for town saints pretty often, or like came together for celebrations. But thinking pre-colonization, my parents and family are still very unknowledgeable about that, and that was what I was looking for. So this experience here at the Field Museum, oh my gosh, I could just go on and on. But one thing I will share here too is that, and this connects with like something that was wrote in my bio, that yes, these pieces have energies. And it was at one of the events that was about weapons, that I really felt that energy. I was handling a Campilan sword, which I had handled many times before with great care. But at that moment, I think what they were asking for was that acknowledgement. And so I had this like really heavy energy, spiritual like shock, like lightning that came through my body. And so it took the moment to like stop what I was doing, gather the team together, say a prayer, and then we continued, and it was this beautiful event that happened. But I think that with this work that I'm creating a space for is this dialogue. And this connects to community in the sense that I had worked with this women's papermaking co-op in the Philippines, Harding ng Kalikasan. And they make handmade paper from their fiber gardens. They grow everything from paper mulberry to abaca or bananas, and coconut, and they use everything. They're so resourceful, and that's one thing that I really took away from them. And I also learned that growing up too. My parents came from the Philippines, so they save everything and just like use everything over and over until you can't repair it anymore. But it reminded me of like, I could also do this in my craft as well. And so with this work, the textures of the Philippines, I was also using recycled materials, but also abaca as a nod to the fibers grown in my motherland. And so just to wrap up, I want to continue this connection with various Filipino communities. So in the Philippines here, the one that I have grown and in Chicago. And I'm finding that there's a lot to still like talk about. And while I've taken a bit of a hiatus from making work, I'm excited to like get back into it. Because I think one thing that is really missing from the work, even the one that is on current display, is that dialogue that I haven't had the chance to have with my Filipino community, or just community in general. Aside from this talk, being able to like share my work, the dialogue is what I really look for and gets me excited. And I think there's a lot to be said around these symbols and motifs, because last story, I recently graduated with my master's in educational leadership, and I was looking for a stole for my graduation ceremony. And all the ones I was finding were just the flags, and the flags just they don't resonate with me. I don't connect to it. It's a colonized symbol, but I realize it's like one of the things that's very recognizable and represents my country. So I could wear that pridefully, but I just didn't want to wear that. And so I had remnants and pieces of cloth that I took and had my friend make my stole from. And so I had this beautiful woven textile that I had been able to acquire when I was in the Philippines in the Cordillera Mountains. And then my dad gave me a barong Tagalog, which is more of like the Spanish influence. And then lastly, this piece from a malong that comes from more of the like Malaysian influence. So it's like this beautiful collection of materials and symbols that really, I think for me at least, better represents my cultural identity. And with that, maraming salamat.
We're going to open the floor to questions. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat while people are typing or thinking through their questions. I guess, can you guys speak a little more to what it is about paper versus other medium? Trisha, you mentioned that you had been working sculpturally prior to the stuff that you were showing. Was that in paper or was it other medium that you were working with?
That was also in paper. But to answer your question, for me, I was really drawn to paper because it was this thing that was like, at least in my knowledge, like really unknown. It wasn't really something that's recognized as like this art medium. It was a craft, and I'm just drawn to like the weird, unique stuff, I think. I think it's a challenge, and also the connection to like the naturalness of to nature. Like you're working in water with these natural fibers, even in this process state of like recycling materials, it still comes from something that was once natural. And I like that. And I also like the ability to use something that's recycled. Just in thinking about like consumption and waste, it just really resonates with me. But I think it's like more of the like working in the water that really I really gravitate towards.
And Julia?
Yeah, I mean, what brought me back into art making as an adult was I painted murals. Wasn't involved in mural painting, but I actually never fell in love with paint, which made it that hard to stick to. But when I started making art on my own and at Santa Monica College, I just knew I wanted to have a low ecological footprint as an artist. It also it freed me up to like make mistakes and to make big mistakes without, having a high cost on the environment. And it also kept the budget for projects low, which I do think is important for an artist, especially when you're starting out. And I just really fell in love with it. I also like moving a material from dry to wet to dry, the idea like transforming a material. It's not magical, but it gives me a lot of hope that other versions are possible of the same fibers, just with different connections. And I just feel like it's like deeply playful, like the wet, the mess. And when I say like play, like in a really important, high, like stimulating, respectful way, I think the playfulness of paper making is really so generative. And then I just found like the more I worked within material limitations, the deeper I dove in, the more the possibilities seemed to open up. And I felt like if I had like dabbled here, dabbled there, things would be a little bit more along the surface. But working within limitations, I found it's like really the place for like deep exploration.
I'm kind of curious. Trisha had mentioned that she was working large, kind of taking that space, making it present, known. But I also noticed that you work large as well. And then it's interesting to hear that you were painting murals, and then so I'm wondering if the large scale, or how important is it for you to work at that scale? What is your reason for working large scale?
Thank you for that question. Trisha, I definitely was feeling a sense of camaraderie there, but yeah, I mean, I would say that I enjoy working in a range of scales to this day, like to make a piece that's satisfying, that you feel like you could dive into, that's like 12 inches by 12 inches, to a piece that really like calls your whole body to be in it. But at the time in grad school, I was really finding my voice and trying to feel comfortable taking up space as a woman. artist, and yeah, and coming into my own as being an artist. And then also, for me, it wasn't just about taking up space, but it was how I wanted to fill space. And I felt like with the paper taking up space, because there was like air in the layers, between the layers, like I felt like it didn't like suck all the air out of the room, and that the pieces move, that it's like responsive to people, as opposed to like stone or brass or bronze that like doesn't move. I realized like my way of taking up space is one that, yeah, is flexible, movable, doesn't suck all the air out of the room, that if you breathe on it, it like absorbs your breath. It doesn't like bounce off. That has a low ecological footprint, and also that packs flat for storage, because it is so much nicer to be a sculptor without like intense storage issues.
Yeah.
So there is like a reality check to it as well. But yeah, I think taking up space, finding my own way of taking up space was really important.
I noticed that both of you also in your presentations mentioned the kind of important, or the role that research has played in your work. But the work that you're creating, even though you're doing this research, is still very personal stories, you know. I don't know that I have a question here. It's just that a through line that I'm seeing in both of your works. I am curious though, like you're being inspired by this research, then when it comes into the gallery space, you know, so much is at least not one-to-one. It's not like the viewer gets to make all of those steps with you. Like, how important is it to you that the viewer, that research is visible on some level to the viewer?
You want me to go? Okay. Well, I think for me, there's a sweet spot of making work where like the head, the research, the hand with the materials, and the heart, the personal stories kind of intersect in this like messy stew that boils down differently with each project, but that there's like a component coming from each, I think is really important to me. As far as like accessing the research, I'm actually interested in kind of holding the story back at first glance, so that there's room for people to enter, to have their own sensorial experience with the work, to make their own interpretations, to bring their own narratives to the story. Like creating that space, holding that space feels really special and important to me. And then if somebody wants to dig deeper, there are ways to access the stories, either like through the statement or through the talks, or, you know, through conversations. But the research is a guide for me, but yeah, I want it to be like accessible in like a second or third run.
Okay.
For me, I think it goes in two different directions, like similar to what Julia was saying about the research. I don't need it necessarily to be upfront. I want to have conversations. It's like more of a foundation and influence, or like a driver for me in where I go with the work. But then also in thinking about like that series that I was doing at the Field Museum, Pamalang Pinoy, which it means Filipino legacy. Having that foundation to like have these conversations, but it doesn't need to be directly tied, or like it doesn't need to be so focused on that. I think it's just the starting point for me. So to have it very much present or at the forefront isn't as important as is the dialogue that comes from it, or that could come from it. especially because what I have done in my research could be completely inaccurate. And that's what we were finding too in those moments where we were bringing community together, is like what we were having written down on these catalog cards and archived was actually wrong when we come to like talk to people that actually, lived with those items and in those villages. So that's really what's more important to me, is like having those conversations or having space for it.
I'm curious about the backstory for the 200-year present piece. You said, "Oh, I could tell you about the backstory if you're interested," and I'd love to hear it.
Sure. Thanks for asking. The piece was commissioned by the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, and it was part of a story that all revolved around Jewish folktales. And I came across this one story that was called The Bird of Paradise. And was it called The Bird of Paradise? No, something about a bird. Okay, this was a while ago, so I'm blanking. But basically, the king, it's a story where the king dies and they're looking for the next king will be like decided by a bird. And the bird chooses a young boy who had never been to school, no formal education, and comes to the city dressed in rags. And everybody's very skeptical that this child can lead a country, a nation, or a state. And into his time in power, they find that he's making very wise decisions. And they ask him, they notice that every day he disappears for a little bit. And finally, one of the advisors says, where do you go every day for an hour? And so he tells them that next to the king, next to his castle, I guess, he had a small, humble hut built, and inside the hut is a mirror, and next to the mirror are the rags that he arrived to the castle in. And every day he goes there for an hour and puts those rags back on and stares in the mirror, just to remember where he came from in order to lead the country forward. So that was the story. And so then the sculpture is mirrored, and the viewers can actually go and stand inside the inside of it. And also I made the piece in 2016, 2017 during the election. And so, and on the outside of it are like torn rags. The whole thing is made out of pulped bed sheets and different color pulp t-shirts. And it's really like a wish for a leader who is humble, who is sensitive to like ecological, environmental, social issues, and who's like responsive to movement around him or her. And the title 200-Year Present comes from somebody who I studied in peace and justice studies in college, Elise Boulding, and she talked about the importance of the present generation making decisions, thinking 3 generations back and 3 generations forward, and that was considered to be 200 years. So the title is called 200-Year Present.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm glad we had a chance to hear the story behind it.
Thank you for asking.
And Trisha, I want the women's co-op that you worked with, did you connect with them through your work with the Field Museum, or was this a separate thing?
That was a separate thing. It was in grad school. So I was working with Melissa Potter, and she had introduced me to this master papermaker, Loreto Apalado, who is based in the Philippines. And I was interested in, just learning more. And I had the chance to go and work with them. He built and really set them up. So built a lot of the equipment that they used, set up their farms, their paper farms. And at the time they were run and managed by a missionary, but recently have the woman that was there at the time, Sister Anne, She's recently retired, and so now they're going through some growing pains of changing management. But yeah, so that was through grad school.
Gotcha. And it sounds like you still kind of keep tabs, keep connected with them.
Yeah, I've been trying my best to help and sustain my relationship with them and support them. One of my projects that I did was I had taken a bunch of their handmade goods to back to Chicago and created this installation. I think it was in one of the pictures of this like sorry store that you typically find like on the side of a road where they'd sell, everyday things like shampoos, but like in different sizes, like, little travel piece sizes to like big bottles. Anyhow, I kind of replicated that with these things that they were selling. And over the years, yeah, I've kept contact. A lot of people really love that the paper, it's really beautiful, and they do these really intricate hand cut images. And so we've been in contact. I've since like ordered stuff, and then like I always send the money back, and the money here goes a really long way. And then recently, like a few years ago, they had reached out to me for some new designs. And so, yeah, still just trying to figure out how to best work with them. And it's really cool because now there are a lot of small businesses here in the States and like in Canada that are utilizing a lot of these artisans back in the Philippines to create things and more like modern versions of things like the Barong Tagalog that I was talking about earlier. And yeah, so I'm just trying to figure out like how can I also help support them and maybe connect them with these small businesses.
So we don't have that much more time, and I do want to promote the third and final talk of the series. But I'm curious, what is like you said, this work has been traveling for a while. What is front of your mind right now in terms of looking forward at your creative practice, and like, is there a project that you're starting on that's germinating? Just love to know.
For me, I have a million, that I've been able to like kind of dabble in, thankfully, in the classroom, because I'm teaching full time. But one that I was thinking about, especially around this conversation about like stoles, is like that, like creating, I don't know if it's stoles or whatever, but just like that, continue that conversation. And yeah, just thinking about the work that is in the show currently, like I said, what that piece that's missing is the community. So maybe taking that work, maybe making new work in the same vein, but then also really focusing on bringing community together again, whether it be here in San Diego or virtually, right? We were just talking about earlier how the pandemic has brought some really great things and access to different things virtually. So yeah, I was just thinking about that a lot lately, of like re-engaging with community.
Community in the actual art making, or community in the dialogue that kind of generates the inspiration for the art making?
I think both, they go hand in hand for me a lot of times. Like when I was working with this group of girls in Bridgeport on my thesis project when I was in grad school. That was a really important part, was just like bring us together so we can have these conversations while we were making art and playing. Julia, I feel like we're kindred spirits, because you were saying a lot of things that I always say is like, I'm just playing, and it frees you up to like make mistakes or just to, explore. So yeah, I think both.
Yeah, I just want to say I felt that too. I felt like a lot of connection between our work and diving it into culture and ancestors and rituals. So thank you for pairing us. I don't know if it was a good coincidence or if it was on purpose, but however it worked out, I'm glad we're here. I am working on towards a two-person show that'll open in September. And I think, and Trisha, maybe I'm constantly adjusting the rhythm of studio work to the rhythm of my life, to the rhythm of our child. And every time life changes, the wonderful thing about papermaking is it's so adaptive that it can change with your life. And so it is, yeah. And now that I'm at a point where I can also imagine working large scale again, which is really nice. And by large scale, I don't mean huge, but I mean big enough to call the full body in. So yeah, I'm working towards a 2-person show, but I actually feel more free than I ever have with the work. I'm just trying to make too much work, or make as much work as I can, and then we'll choose from that work. And really, one piece is kind of leading to the next piece. I mean, the vocabulary's there, the material's there, the conversation is, I'm really interested in like family dynamics, cycles of care and vulnerability, and how they're echoed in astronomy, the cosmos, thinking about women and families in astronomy, and always with like the torn bed sheets and t-shirts. So it's unfolding one piece at a time, with a show ahead in September most immediately.
Thank you all so much. And you were talking about pairing you guys together. Honestly, I don't know that I could have made a bad pair. Rennie and Melissa did such a wonderful job curating this exhibition, and the works really do speak to one another.
Mm-hmm.
So let me I've got to share my screen for these final remarks, but thank you all so much for taking the time to talk about your work and give our viewers greater insight into just your process, your thought process, and what brought you there. To you all joining us tonight, if you enjoyed this talk and would like to see more free virtual programming, we do accept donations at the museum. Again, if you're coming through Atlanta, or if you're in town, please come by and see the show. Those photos that you just saw pop up there, they went pretty quickly, but that's the work installed in the exhibition. If you can't make it to Atlanta, you can go on our website, paper.gatech.edu, to see those installation shots a little more closely. And if you give us a week or so, we will have the recording for the artist talk up. You can also find the Paper Museum on all of the social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest. And if you'd like to get our newsletter, you can contact our education curator, Anna Dahl, at anna.dahl@rbi.gatech.edu.
Well, Jerusha, thank you for moderating the panel and the introductions and everything. It's really lovely.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. This has been really great.
I could listen to you guys talk about your work all night. And for folks that tune in to our final talk, we'll be hearing from Jillian Bruchera and Marilyn Propp, and Marilyn's on the talk tonight. So please join us on July 12th for the final talk. I think I've got it on the July 12th, same time, 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you are in Atlanta, we will be having an in-person closing reception Friday, August 4th from 6 to 8. All right, guys, I think that's a wrap.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rennie. Thank you, Marilyn, for coming.
It's always good to be refreshed. with the backstory. You always learn something new.
Yeah.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.